Well, you could be forgiven for thinking that the war in Ukraine is ancient history. The media certainly seem to have moved on, and there's another thing that we're supposed to be outraged these days, and no doubt there'll be another one in only another few weeks or months' time. But of course, for the people of Ukraine and for the soldiers that Russia has sent to the front lines, this is very much an ongoing concern. And concern is the word of the day, especially as things have developed the way that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has begun to become, well, I'm putting my words on this, increasingly authoritarian. There are some very, very dark shadows of history that seem to be extending themselves across Ukraine at the moment. My next guest is someone who is trying to raise the alarm on a very specific example of that, and that is Robert Amsterdam. He joins me now on the Aussie Wire. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're a man with tremendous personal experience in the legal world, fighting some very, very interesting legal battles from Russia itself through to Venezuela and many other places in between. What is the battle that you're now involved in fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church?
Well, I'm privileged to act for the Holy Synod, and we are fighting a battle against a government that, in an absence of military victories, has decided that they will essentially claim the carcass of a 1,000-year-old church and mount it as some sort of trophy. And, our position is very simple. Number one, we absolutely support the people of Ukraine with respect to all of their desires to achieve whatever funding may be available. But we don't believe the church should be sacrificed as some sort of PR offering. Essentially, the Zelensky government is attempting to rid Ukraine of anything that has any historical connection to Russia. And because the church was at one point affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church from a canonical standpoint, not, in fact, it has been independent since the early 90s, but they are using this as a way of attempting, firstly, through a bill to ban the church, secondly, to expropriate its assets and turn them over to a new state church that was founded 5 years ago, that is essentially a nationalist development, an autocephalous church, where the services are now more conducted in Ukrainian than Church Slavonic. And I, being a fairly old guy, recoil at this attempt by a secular power anywhere to interfere in the spiritual activity of their populace, especially in a manner this egregious, this unwarranted, this lacking in any form of evidential fiber. I mean, they are falsely accusing priests who are in their 70s of somehow having a pamphlet or something that supports Russia and then jailing them for 5 years. I mean, these are
Wow.
tactics I fought against in Putin's Russia, and I am fighting against in Zelensky's Ukraine. And simply because I support Ukraine does not mean that I shut my eyes and close my ears to the goings on there. And the goings on are not good. Zelensky's government now controls almost 80% of the economy. Rule of law is a joke. They're doing forcible conscription of members of our church. They are physically assaulting priests. It's a horror show, and it is backed up by a massive investment the Ukrainians have made in propaganda, which, by the way, is supported by Western press. You
Yeah.
cannot break through in the media about this story. And hats off this morning to the British newspaper, The Telegraph, who I believe is the first major media to carry a story about this after this has been going on for months and months. So, it is, I have come across this when I have gone to meet politicians. I've had staff interrupt me and basically shut down my ability to communicate because they appear either in the pay of or as some sort of disciples of the Ukrainian regime. And this narrow minded, incapacity of accepting criticism that I've found throughout my dealings with any member of the Ukrainian government just doesn't stand. I mean, to be honest, I've found African countries under autocratic rule to be more willing to listen to criticism than the Ukrainians.
Well, it's certainly a concern given that the war is now dragging on. It has become a meat grinder, and immense suffering is taking place every single day on those front lines. And yet, though people fighting on those front lines are saying things like this, we have a clip here. This is a young Ukrainian soldier. I'll read the subtitles for those that are listening to the podcast. He's speaking in his native tongue, of course. This is what he had to say. People in military uniform should be here where I am at the front where there is a lack of people. Explain to me, how is it so? Tell me why we have only a couple of people at the front holding the line of defense. Whilst somewhere inside the rear, people in uniform are breaking churches, beating priests, beating the Ukrainian people, destroying churches. People in military uniform should be here where I am at the front. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to imagine the suffering and the violence that man is witnessing and is involved in as someone who's a combatant in war. Whilst back at home in the city that he thought he was defending, he's watching the very thing that he thought he was defending be pulled apart. What is he talking about there with these churches being destroyed? Is that literal or is that metaphorical?
No, he's speaking literally. We have young kids being taken out of schools at 3 a.m. And bused to other locations. We have priests with broken jaws defending their churches. We have dozens of illegal arrests. We have forced conscription of believers. I mean, this is absolutely no joke. The people behind the new church appear to be violently predatory. And it's not a religious dispute because, in fact, many of the places they take over, they close. So it is, in part, it's ethnic. There is, I believe, a feeling that some of these churches are in areas where there's a stronger Russian minority. And it's also generational. Many of the members of the church that I'm representing are the more devout, more elderly, as I think we all can understand. As you get older and you get closer to your calling, you become more sensitive to regular attendance, if you will, increasing your chances of going up as opposed to down. And it's part of what's gotten me so incredibly driven about this. I'm a Jew. And the idea that I would go to synagogue one day and I would be told that I need to pray in English as opposed to Hebrew, and the rabbi's not the same guy as I'm used to. I mean, all of these things, I just find appalling.
Yeah.
And the fact that Christian leaders are saying nothing. The only guy who's spoken up is an American journalist named Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Who is wildly criticized, whose views I don't necessarily agree with, but more power to him. He had me on his show. We got 55 million views.
Yeah.
Now, why did we get so many views? Number one, a guy named Elon Musk retweeted it with the caption that said, "They're beating priests?" ?
Yeah.
And people are actually desperate for real information, and I think they understand we're in a moment. I would call it and compare it to a McCarthyite period, where information is not traveling. I was interviewed by the London Times 2 months ago. They wanted to find out who was funding us. They had no interest in the story, and they didn't publish it.
Yeah.
Because if you're not supporting, and even though I am supporting Ukraine, but if you're saying anything that's negative about Ukraine, they don't want to know where you're from. And to me, that's not journalism. And it's a very dangerous part of the war in Ukraine that we are becoming so uneducated about what's going on. One of the things that I find appalling about the present day and the sanctioning process with respect to Russia and other countries, and I'm sure soon China, is that we are turning these countries into far greater enemies than they need to be.
Yeah.
And we are making them, we are dehumanizing them. We are shutting off our ability to talk to them. We're empowering autocrats like Putin by making sure that the people around him have to stay with him because they have no access to the West.
Yeah.
The Ukrainians have been the worst at sanctioning. They sanction everybody. And by sanctioning everybody, no one respects their sanctions list. So their sanctioning is for them, it's a replacement for rule of law. They simply have none anymore.
Yeah.
And the Zelensky government will be, in time exposed in terms of the corruption, in terms of the autocracy, in terms of for instance, this attack on the church is a PR instrument for their domestic consumption. There's no actual evidence that this church is aiding the Russians at all. And if it were, God forbid, the individuals who might be involved could be charged criminally.
Sure.
You don't ban a church. And in fact, in a week, we're coming out with a further white paper on how illegal and contrary to rule of law and EU standards this incredibly stupid bill is. This stupid bill is counterproductive. It is against Ukraine's interests as well as rule of law.
I'm going to pause you there. You mentioned that you've got another white paper coming out, but we haven't yet mentioned that you have actually released a white paper already. And those that want to dive deeper into this and really begin to wrap their heads around what it is that we're supporting, and it's a shame that we have to put in these disclaimers, but it's necessary on the topic of Russia, Ukraine. I'm all in favor of Ukraine's right to self-defense. I certainly do not support Putin's attack on Ukraine. And there are a lot of people that have sort of been saying, oh, Putin's really the good guy in this. And I've always been pushing back and saying, I'm not so sure that there is a good guy in this particular war. That's where I stand on this particular issue. But one thing that should concern us is that our tax money and our materiel and our international standing and reputation and our list of friends and our list of enemies are all now being wrapped up in this particular conflict. And if you want to understand what's really going on, the Freedom of Religion Under Attack in Ukraine white paper that you've released at savetheuoc.com is where people can download that and find that. Now, what's the way forward for you? You've already mentioned that the rule of law in Ukraine is broken. Surely you're not expecting to be able to win within Ukraine. So where is this legal battle being fought?
Well, look, it is being fought through a lobbying campaign. It is going to be fought in the courts because, as we've demonstrated in this new white paper, everything the Ukrainians are doing is contrary to the European Court of Human Rights, the basic tenets of human rights law there. This act is disproportionate. It's got really no grounding factually. I mean, again, it's a stopgap measure. Sadly, for the Ukrainians, the counteroffensive was not a success. And they believe that somehow really harassing and intimidating their fellow citizens during a time of war is the go-to thing to do. And I just, as I said, this could not be done at a more difficult time for Ukraine. It will impact them negatively with American legislators. It's just a foolish thing to do. And it's solely for domestic consumption. It's solely so he can keep the votes in support of the ultra right wing super nationalists. And I denounce them for this blatantly political chicanery that more belongs in the New York of the 19th century Tammany Hall than it should in a democratic society.
Yeah. Well, Robert Amsterdam, thank you so much for your time. I wish strength to your arm as you fight this particular fight on behalf of religious freedom. Religious freedom is something that affects us all, whether we are actually individually religious or not. The principles, when they are lost for absolutely everyone. So thank you so much for what you're doing. We'll stay across this story and bring updates to our viewers here at the Aussie Wire as they come to hand. Robert Amsterdam, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.